Firstly, thank you for having me. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jamie Brazier. I'm an associate in the digital and technology team at Russell's, where I mainly advise businesses in the entertainment sector or looking to move into the entertainment sector in connection with commercial agreements, technology and IT agreements, and data privacy compliance. And I'm sure I've met quite a few of you before at various MTUK events, but um, and as Matt touched on previously, Russell's is an entertainment law firm, and we've got a particular focus on the music industry. And I'm part of the technology and digital team, which sits within that, um, in the context of the wider firm. And so the purpose of today's session is to dig a bit more into the difficulties presented by the use of data by music technology startups and the things you need to be thinking about in order to use data appropriately. You don't need me to tell you that over the past few years, data, and in particular personal data, has become immensely valuable and a key asset for startups in the music industry. So rather than me just talk to you about data privacy law for an hour and personal data in the abstract, which I know you don't want at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, we've invited James here today from Planet Fans, who's going to share some of the insights that he's gained from building and scaling a startup in the music technology sector, in which data is really a key asset. Now, before I get going with speaking of James, a couple of terms for those of you that may not be as familiar with the area of personal data and data. So, where we refer to personal data, we're talking about data that by itself or used with another piece of information can be used to identify someone. So typically think of things like names, telephone numbers, IP addresses. Um, and when we talk about controllership or being a data controller, we're talking about um, a person that makes the decision on how data is used, and so ultimately says, okay, I want to use personal data in this way. And when we talk about a processor, we're talking about someone that is effectively following the instructions of a controller. So I'm using data in a way that someone else has prescribed. If there are any other terms we use in the session that anyone's not familiar with, or that we don't explain as we go, please do butt in. We can try and expand on those. So James, Matt's already given us a bit of an overview about Planet Fans, but perhaps it would be helpful for you to explain a little more about why you chose to set up the company, particularly in light of what you were seeing in relation to how different actors in the music industry and the ecosystem were using and processing data.
Yeah, for sure. Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me along. It's great to be part of this community for the last couple of years. Yeah, I think I've sort of met a few people on the call, but for those that don't know me, my background, I've worked in sort of music, sport, entertainment for most of my career, largely on the commercial side. But recently, before Planet, I was working for AEG, um, and yeah, that's obviously an organization that's got lots of different kind of arms and legs to it, from promotion to venue ownership to a ticketing company. And I think what I observed there, and probably some of the frustrations that I observed there, was definitely a strong reason for starting Planet. But obviously then spent a bit of time kind of trying to dig in and understand all of the different other arms of the business, the music business, that I wasn't so familiar with across the recorded side, during a sort of initial discovery phase. And I think that sort of making it, without sort of telling the story too far and wide about what Planet is, I think in terms of data and relation to data, the biggest problem that we identified through that and saw through that is that data was incredibly siloed. And rightly or wrongly, that some people sort of think that there's huge gatekeepers out there, and I think there are definitely big gatekeepers out there in terms of big tech, more so than necessarily specific to the music industry, where artists increasingly didn't have a direct relationship with their fan base. And I know there's a lot of people on this call and in the community that are solving problems in lots of different areas there. Um, I think, yeah, obviously with the last few years of AI and the amount of traffic that's on the internet now, that I think there's a stat I saw the other day that over 50% of traffic in 2025 will be actually bot related. So I think in terms of understanding who your real customer is, that's a driver that, as Jamie mentioned earlier, we're seeing across the board. Where we set out to focus and the platform that we've tried to build is effectively a smart membership layer for live audiences and live events. From my background at AEG, we definitely saw that the ticketing companies hold a huge amount of data, but it's all data that's opted into them. It's data that's there to be used to get you into a building, to get you a ticket into your hands, and necessarily wasn't really designed to do anything else with that data. And as a result, that meant that fans are getting quite a disconnected experience. They're not able to hear directly from the act that they're going to see. They're really only hearing from the venue or from the ticketing company. And that was a trend that we saw that fans didn't really want. They didn't want to become a fan of the O2. They didn't want to become a fan of Access, our ticketing company. They wanted to become, go deeper into the artist world and deeper into the experience that they'd signed up for. And as a result of that sort of data siloing, I think a lot of the artists we spoke to in the early days were just basically saying, I do eventually get this data from those parties, but it's in a spreadsheet. It's 10 years old in some senses with some of the sort of more legacy artists. And I don't know if those people still exist, whether it's real, or anything really that useful about them, and it's totally inactionable. So what we coin ourselves in terms of we're trying to build an activation layer that connects up the experience for fans, and ensures that the artist is primarily in control of that data, so that they can better plug different parts and different experiences, whether that be merchandise, whether that be recorded music, whether that be any facet of their world that they're thinking about, more directly into that experience. So, and I think when we set this company up 4 years ago, I think it's really evolved from a data perspective. In the early days when we were doing this, a lot of music managers were like, I don't know if I don't want to be the data controller. I don't have the resource or the want to be a data controller. So that was quite an interesting sort of experience for us, I think, in terms of how we set the business up initially versus where we are today.
Great, thanks, James. And it's interesting what you say as well on, originally being offered kind of these outdated sets of data from venues in particular. I mean, one thing when we have negotiations with different companies in the music industry, they always say, look, we've got these consents, you can use this data, but actually people forget that those consents go out of date. Usually, roughly every 10 years, you would want to refresh someone's consent, particularly if they're not opening emails you're sending out or engaging with any marketing. So after a period, it can effectively go obsolete. Um, so I think that's a very interesting point that you're trying to address. So it's fairly clear then that data is intrinsic to your business. Now, when you launched, did you give much thought to ensuring you were compliant with, say, GDPR and data privacy laws? Because I know certainly from what we see is a lot of people are really concerned about the possibility of enforcement action. You're a small startup growing, you're processing personal data, and you've heard of the GDPR and there are fines, but they often don't launch into heavy investigations into that space. And I think people sometimes see it as a risk they're willing to take on. But there's another strand to that, which is the commercial angle, which is if you have a data heavy business and down the line you want to sell a product that uses that data to say a major, if you've not got the consents or something in place, they're not going to be interested in that data. They are the ones that are more likely to bear the risk of enforcement action. And so even if you don't think you'll have action taken against you. Um, it's not unfathomable that someone that might want to invest in you, might want to engage with you could. So yeah, so when you were kind of getting off the ground, is, I guess, legal compliance something you thought about much?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It's always one of those things, as you say, it's time, cost of resource, and cost of sort of putting the right systems in place. And naturally, when you're scaling a startup, you're trying to build the platform and you're trying to find clients and all of those sorts of things. And I can definitely see it sort of comes down the pecking order at times. I think two things. One, I was very fortunate to sort of co-found the business with someone who'd worked in a very more boring space of the world in procurement, supply chain, and enterprise technology, who sort of really understood kind of the likes of Vodafone, AstraZeneca, and how they wanted to handle data. So, and we were setting the business up to work with bigger and bigger customers. We built the platform as a sort of two-sided approach for both fans and then the sort of the controllers of that data behind that for fans. One of the interesting parts that we've set out to do is to make sure that the data is as clean and as actionable as possible, and that requires removing bots, removing touts, and a number of those sorts of things. So I think you really had to sort of consider all of that in the mix right from the get-go. And I think the approach that we've always taken, I think when you're representing someone else's data, is transparency. Maybe they haven't always been as transparent as they'd like to be because of the parties that they've worked with. But I think when you're resetting this and you're not trying to take legacy data points, you're trying to take new data points and understand fans and make this a sort of two-way relationship rather than a sort of one-way broadcast. You have to have that transparency. I think the consumer, well, us as all consumers, I think, are more and more aware of the amount of data that we're giving away on a daily basis, and the amount of data we're being asked for on a daily basis. So yeah, the first bit was transparency, and we took a really good bit of advice from a firm that we worked with in the early days on this, which was that your privacy policy had to not be legal jargon. It had to be something that an average consumer could read and understand and know why you're taking a certain amount of data points and why it's beneficial to them. There has to be like that two-way value exchange of, okay, why am I taking your IP address? Well, why am I taking your mobile number? Why am we asking you to install a digital wallet pass? All of these sorts of things. So we've always been on the front foot of trying to simplify that from a consumer, so that there's less confusion as to about why you're holding their data and for what purposes. Um, as I mentioned in the early days, a lot of artists wanted us to be the data controller, so that we'll come on to that. There's a bit of evolution there, but I think the key for us was also not being another gatekeeper and handcuffing the people that we work with to the platform because we owned and controlled their data. I think it was the value in our platform is making the data actionable, and the more we make the data actionable, the more we make your fans return, the more that we keep them active, and not mean that they just sort of become an inactive fan that sits on a mailing list. The more that we can make them active, the longer that you're going to stay with us as a client, rather than saying, well, you have to stay with us because all of your data's siloed into this new thing, and just creating another silo. So I think those sort of points were sort of really key from the outset. I think we're fortunate to be based in the UK, where GDPR is sort of a gold standard globally. We definitely work with US artists and US teams who have a much more laissez-faire approach to how data is collected and managed, but we hold ourselves to that sort of GDPR standard in terms of we don't use legitimate interest as a way of communicating to fans. We're very clear that if you do select marketing opt-in, that we respect that marketing opt-in, and in fact we actually go even further and ask for your very granular preferences about what you want to hear from that artist, and we encourage the artists to and venues and brands that we work with not to broadcast to everyone all in one go, to take a very segmented approach, because that ultimately increases engagement and keeps people engaged, rather than getting an email a week and thinking, okay, right, it's time to unsubscribe from that opt-in. So we have sort of, and we've built tools all around that everything that we have on the sort of dashboard, our side is all about segmentation, all about grouping up audiences, and being hyper targeted and personalized on that. So I think that's been strong for us, I think, to make sure that the consent is there for everyone. We do also operate a service that you sign up for, whether it's getting access to tickets or it's so you don't have to opt in. I think it's important, particularly what we're doing is a lot of people come in and install the pass as a way of getting pre-sale access. That doesn't mean that you should have to opt into marketing communications. You're coming in because that's the reason that you want to come in. So again, we're very clear with the segmentation on that, and any data that we're then sharing. If we are the data controller or the processor, we're being very clear about who has consented to marketing in the future. And I think where it's becoming easier and easier is if the IP owner, I'll put it the best way, brand, artist, venue, is the data controller, then that makes that data super portable, and that they can take it back up into a CRM system and a mailing list system with all of those right consents, and don't feel like they have to use this platform for every bit of communication that they're doing. I think that's quite important, that we're not trying to own that sort of single view of the customer, especially when they're working with major labels and other parties where some of those things they have sort of different deals, where some of those kind of communications need to go through different systems. So I think we've been through a good curve of educating the people that we work with, as well as educating fans as to why we're taking that data.
Thanks very much, James. That's certainly very helpful. And I saw we had a question come through, I think, from
Yeah.
from
So we've got
Tom.
one from Tom Grayson. Hi, Tom. So is there a concept under UK EU data regulation of an exemption or small company defence that a new company can call on as a shield against harsh fines whilst it defines its business and grows its business?
I can see Jane as well has responded on that, and I agree with her comments. There isn't that's okay, Jane, don't worry. There is no small company defense under the GDPR, and I think part of the reason for that is, yeah, and I've seen this in kind of due diligence processes for companies before. You can have a small company that processes a vast amount of data about people, and if they have a leak or that data is compromised, if they could kind of put their hands up and say, um, sorry, we're only small, the individuals implicated in that are going to be quite frustrated. And I think it's always worth remembering that personal data law is there to protect us all. It's there, you all have no doubt had those emails where from brands or a company saying, I'm sorry, your data's been compromised, and you start getting more and more of them, and you're like, how much of my data is actually out there now? But no, that whilst there isn't a defense of that per se, and as Jane wrote on the chat, they're unlikely to take enforcement action against you for a first or a minor offence. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, is quite a pragmatic regulator in my experience. However, there's this concept of a pattern of non-compliance that we often see in data protection law, which is, if you have a couple of small breaches or areas where you've not been able to comply, they're not going to take action against you, or are unlikely to. But if you do down the line have a data breach, they'll have it on their record that you may not have kind of complied fully before, and so it will lean against your favor if there is a continuing pattern of non-compliance. But as I say, they are pragmatic, and they're not expecting a music tech startup to have the same privacy compliance levels as Google. I would use Facebook as that example, but they don't really have any compliance levels anyway. Um, so the next question then for
So Jamie,
James. Oh,
just to jump in on that, I suppose, just
yeah.
from some of our experience, albeit that you might be quite compliant as well and quite small, and the footprint be quite small, I think we're all building on technology. I mean, all of us probably saw the AWS outage last week, but we're all building on technology of other third parties, and I think that's great. Like we couldn't have built some of the platforms that we built in 10 years ago at the speed that we are now. But obviously we're then plugging in, and we have third party, what we call third party dependencies, a lot across the board. We actually had Twilio had a data breach that was from one of their third parties. So it was probably 5 or 6 companies removed from us, but there was some information that was exposed, mobile numbers only, not full personal information. But we had to then have a process in place to. We were notified by Twilio, and then you have to contact. We're the end basically holder of that data, and we have to contact them. So at that point, they're obviously handling the fault and the risk. But I think reputationally, when you're trying to be transparent and you're handling other people's, there is a knock-on effect, and it may not be your fault either. So I think it's quite interesting just to make sure that you've got those processes in place that mean that you can, we contacted the ICO in that instant and said, what's the best approach here based on this, because it was quite a nuanced kind of data breach, and they also give you quite good advice. So having a good dialogue with them is actually not a bad thing, and just seeing them as a regulator, they're actually quite a useful resource.
Yeah, and that's accurate from my experience as well, James. I've seen a lot of clients engage with the ICO, and if open engagement is always a good sign, particularly to encourage a pattern of compliance. And I actually think that leads us quite nicely onto the next question, which I had from you, which really relates to kind of how you keep data clean in particular. So when people think about what they should do correct in relation to processing personal data, there are kind of various strands to that. There's making sure you get the right permissions from individuals directly, making sure you're getting the right permissions from third parties, and making sure you've got the mechanisms in place to enable you to share that data with commercial partners, as well as making sure that personal data is kept safe and secure. And so it can seem a bit overwhelming at times. What did you, or do you, find most tricky when it comes to, I guess, exploiting data properly? And is there anything that you see other kind of players in the market struggle with?
Exploiting is an interesting
Exploit, yeah.
phrase. I mean, I think we tend to sort of go down the route of actioning data on behalf of those that need it, and being that enabler. I think, as I said, initially we started off building a platform which I'm sure many people are doing if they're building an app as well, where there's a single login to your app. The consents are then taken at a platform level, and as a result, that means that if I signed up for one artist, I could then sign up for another artist with that same account. So a sort of what we call a single tenant solution. I think that was quite interesting in the days, because it was a quick way of cross-pollinating audiences and enabling artists and fans to have a more seamless approach. What we found as we scaled to bigger and bigger artists is that there's no one size fits all in the music industry. Each individual artist had, or even venues have their own nuances and requirements in terms of consent. They need additional third parties to have consent on that data. If you're a major label signed artist, some of the bigger artists can have it totally white label and just be them. Some of the mid-range artists actually are probably the ones that are trickiest, where the label needs to have an opt-in as well as them, but then they also have a mailing list that runs with the label. And are you contradicting that marketing opt-in by creating a new platform? So we found ourselves in quite a tricky place probably a couple of years ago, where we were sort of effectively getting into arguments about each individual contract and each individual data ownership. And we were a tech platform. We didn't want to be in those arguments, and it was sucking up an awful lot of resource. So we actually made a pretty sort of sizable step change in how we store and control data, moving to a multi-tenant platform, so that every account that you create is specific to that artist or venue. And as a result, that meant we could have custom consents, custom privacy policies, custom terms and conditions for each individual. And that took us sort of out of that argument, but also gave greater flexibility in terms of that nuance that not everyone's going to be able to have the same flat conditions. And I think that's something we do see some others struggling in the sort of marketplace with, is when they're the data controller, or they're opted into the data, they then are responsible for how does that data get to other third parties. So by doing this, it means that, as I said, that in an ideal world, the artist is, or the person that we're working with is the data controller, and in many cases, because of the amount of data we're taking, we're an independent data controller. So we're there, and we're named within the privacy policy as a very clear reason as to why we exist, and that we power the platform, and that we hold your data to ensure that it can operate and it can work. But equally, from a marketing perspective, we have no rights to market to that data. And I think that was an interesting kind of step for us, because a lot of investors at times are sort of saying to you, well, do you have any rights over the data? Do you have any marketing rights over the data? Because there's value there from an investment perspective. But we actually found that when you speak to a few investors, if it's not your data, and you aren't really going to market to them without the consent of that artist, it doesn't really have any value. So it didn't necessarily really change the picture for us. But that was an interesting sort of decision, and not a small tech task to undertake. And I think if we'd had our time again, we'd have probably researched that space a little bit more, and set the thing up as a multi-tenant platform right from the get-go, rather than as a single tenant platform.
Absolutely. So I guess moving on in your story, Planet Fans has gone through a lot of growth over the past few years. What would you say kind of the key differences in how you processed stored data when you started to how you do it now? Would you say your approach has changed and become more kind of efficient, streamlined?
I think interesting that, I think a lot of us will probably start off by going into bigger enterprise organizations and sort of targeting them, the bigger hubs. I think it's obviously an efficient way to go into the music industry and understand needs and requirements at a macro level. But yeah, we started off with probably the early adopters, those that lean into technology first, and they were sort of forward-thinking managers and smaller organizations. So we could work with smaller organizations, and there were less heavy requirements. Obviously, taking sort of GDPR aside, I think in terms of as you say, infosec sort of compliance standards, there weren't really any being enforced upon us. We were probably enforcing them. But as you mature as a business, you want to work with these bigger and bigger partners. You work with, and if you are setting up that you're a processor on behalf of a big artist and they want to share the data across multiple different parties, those parties want to understand how you're storing the data, what procedures and policies you have in place. And so I think we've been fortunate to evolve with the partners that we work with. I suppose we've probably reached the pinnacle, I would say, at this point of that. We've recently signed a partnership with Amazon Music, and given all of our data stored within AWS, they have the most insight into the best practice that we should be putting in place. But I think that you can take quite a pragmatic approach, because I think getting SOC 2 or getting a certificate that you are the gold standard of compliance is very, very expensive. I think there are more and more platforms out there that help you make that a cheaper sort of exercise. We've used Vanta as a platform that's helped us sort of track and work through the different levels of compliance that you need to be to reach SOC 2, which we're not fully certified at the moment. But equally, the partners that we work with don't expect us to be fully certified. I think they understand that until you reach a certain level of data that you're holding, but also commercial value of that contract, that they can't necessarily stipulate huge amounts of cost and on ongoing cost to sort of validate that if the contract is still in a sort of pilot period or is still in a trial period. So rightly or wrongly, we've been able to take an approach of sort of remediation timelines, being very transparent about where we're at in terms of data compliance, and agree that certain milestones and certain gates that we go through based on whether it's a long-term commercial agreement or whether it's a short-term trial agreement, what the risk factors are within that, and being able to make sure that we hit those remediation timelines and aren't just saying here's a timeline that we're going to hit and then not doing anything about it, but investing in a staged approach rather than basically saying we can't work with you until you reach SOC 2. And I think so that would be, I think, something that we were nervous about, obviously going into working with major enterprise companies, that we just weren't going to be able to work with them until we were SOC 2. And that's a bit of a chicken and egg for a startup, is that you've got to go and spend 50, £100,000 over here to get SOC 2 compliant, but then you may not actually be working with that business and you may not understand the commercial value of that contract. So I think they have been pretty, every partner that we've come across has been pretty pragmatic on that, and we deal with kind of big enterprise info security teams, and it can be a bit of a process and it definitely sucks up a bit more resource, but I think it's sort of a risk reward kind of balance that you need to take to it.
Yeah, no, it's certainly interesting the points you raised there, and actually, a lot of the times, what I'm seeing my end is that people are wanting to be a controller of data. I don't like to use the term own that data, but they want to make the decisions on data and hold it, but they don't really give too much thought to the security elements. A lot of the time when we think about privacy, we're thinking about, am I using this in the right way? Am I getting the right consents? But actually, when it comes to receiving that data, they're not necessarily giving thought to making sure that it's stored in a safe and secure way that can't be breached or leaked in any way. Because that's ultimately where a lot of the risk in practice comes from. And it's something that, when we have conversations and say record deals, that people were looking to be controllers of personal data, but they've not actually got the mechanics in place to act as a controller in terms of, say, having a CRM system or having some way that they can manage that data in a way that isn't just an Excel spreadsheet on their desktop, which is typically not something we would advise. So that's really useful. So I think I've just got one more question for you then, James, today. So
Hey, Jamie, should we just break and just see if anyone's got any questions from the
sure.
group before we just go into the final question? Any questions from anyone at all before we move on? Anything at all? All right, cool. Yeah, over to you, Jamie.
No problem. So bearing in mind that startups don't don't necessarily aim for the gold standard of privacy compliance, which is in part due to the fact they don't have the resources to do so. If you were to rewind and start up Planet Fans again, what would you prioritize or do differently in terms of I guess data privacy compliance processing data at that stage, noting that obviously you would have the same resources?
Yeah, I think obviously the bigger that you get and the more people that have access to the data, I think in the early days you want everyone to be able to move as fast as they can, and you probably don't necessarily think about permissions and kind of ways of usage in the same way that we do now. Um, I think I think it actually isn't hugely resource heavy. It's probably setting up the right kind of policies initially internally, when you onboard the team, that you just get that into the part of the onboarding habit. And a lot of it is, I think, from what I've seen, a lot of it's quite sort of common sense in terms of, we have a very simple rule in terms of that people can only access personal data on a sort of need to know basis. And so you can define when you're onboarding someone whether they're going to need to have access to the data that you're holding and storing, and just setting that out from the get-go, I think is something that sort of feels like quite a simple thing to do. But once, if you start introducing that and you've already got a team of 10, and everyone's got access to the data, you've got to sort of wind back a little bit and change how they work and change the sort of the ways of working. So I think there's sort of simple things that like that you can do right from the early days that just feel common sense, but maybe don't always naturally come straight away. And then and there's a bunch of stuff within that happy to sort of share that kind of basic things, that you don't necessarily think about when you're asking people to join a startup and use their own device or use their own laptop and things like that. But then I think equally on the flip side, from a client perspective, we as a business that's handling data sort of take on a lot, I think, in terms of educating others about how to use that data and the best practice to store that. And I don't necessarily think that we should also have to do that always. I think we would probably, if I had the time again, you would partner with others who've got this expertise. And I think there's a lot of different interpretation of data law, I would say, that you see across different markets and across different places and spaces. And as a result, we try and hold ourselves to a good standard, but we're not lawyers and we're not the experts. So I think being able to partner up with resources that you can sort of signpost people towards, but not literally hold their hand through every single step, and say don't be saying don't store data on your laptop and all of those sorts of things that you referenced, Jamie. I think with smaller organizations particularly, there are a lot of small businesses in the music industry that don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the resource to do this. So I think we would probably be partnering up and trying to almost productize that a little bit in the future, or in the past if we did this again, to sort of say, hey, well, look, we're not going to do all of this for you. I think on that basis.
We've got a
Perfect. Thank
question.
you.
Got a question from Tom Grayson. Are there outsourced service providers who can handle all these obligations cost effectively on a new company's behalf?
So it might. So I won't fly the flag for lawyers, but there are services that do offer, certainly from the paperwork side, the ability to manage obligations. So, privacy policies, cookie policies. The most common one you'll see is OneTrust. And a lot of websites that you go on, you'll get that kind of, it's a very generic looking cookie banner and it'll always say OneTrust at the top, and they'll manage that side of things. Um, in terms of the, I guess the obligations in relation to contractual stuff. So when you're doing kind of data sharing agreements, that's a bit more bespoke, and you do again get you kind of get outsourced data protection officers that can kind of that will sit generally, and they'll effectively act as a DPO as a number of different companies, and they can kind of manage those obligations for you. For context, like not every company needs a DPO, but every company can have a DPO, and you can get someone in that will effectively do that for you. But the one thing I don't know is the cost of any of these things. I think a lot of them will depend on what you're doing and your size as well as you grow.
That's great. Thank you. And Dimitri Garins just asked, would you recommend signing special agreements with the team around data accountability?
So I think there's kind of a legal answer and a practical answer. The lawyer in me could say, yes, you could have something in there where they indemnify you for any loss, if they breach the data protection policies. But in principle, I think when you've got a startup, there's got to be kind of a degree of trust in relation to you and the team that you're working with. I would certainly put in place kind of best practices and a policy in relation to how you use data, and there should be some accountability in relation to that. But I think if they breach that, there just needs to be some kind of proportionality in terms of what happens. Um, but certainly having in place is quite common that we prepare internal privacy procedures effectively for staff, and that's a requirement that as you get bigger, you're supposed to have anyway, but to ensure that staff are handling things effectively. But yeah, I think the question mark comes down to what happens when they breach that.
Yeah, I think there's obviously it depends on like how deliberate that is. I think increasingly one of the things that we've seen, um, and I think particularly when in the space that we're in, you see a lot of sort of phishing emails and things like that, which the team aren't necessarily sort of super aware of, and so I think training has been a really key part of this, and I think you can enforce that accountability more if you're providing the resources and regular training and onboarding to make sure that everyone's aware of kind of reporting anything that might create a breach or yeah, I think there's sort of probably two sides to it. I think yeah, so as long as you've given people the right tools and the right understanding, we do regular sort of questionnaires or regular sort of spoofing tests and things like that, that our CTOs sort of put in place to make sure that people are kind of aware and thinking about this sort of stuff a bit more often. And we circulate sort of checklists, weekly checklists to sort of consider around it. So I think you have to give everyone the tool if you're going to try and enforce it and ask to put that in a sort of an agreement with the team. You also need to provide sort of the tools and resources to make sure that they're sort of thinking about that as well.
And I had a question in terms of a lot of these kind of documents that you might be using. Are the templates available anywhere that people can access, or does it, by its very nature, need to be quite bespoke?
So so in terms of like a privacy policy that every business should have if you're processing data, the ICO has a template generator on their website. They also have a tool that you can use to work out whether you should be listed as a controller on their register. But they do offer a template. You'll input some information and they'll spit it out. I will put a big caveat on it in that the ICO said this is not kind of a foolproof uh, privacy policy. And when we see it, it's not kind of, it's by no means the gold standard. And a lot of the time we kind of suggest people do that and then get it checked by someone with experience in the area to tidy it up. But certainly as a starting point, it's quite good. Similarly, you can get for things like website cookie banners and that, you can get free tools out there that will implement that and put in place a free cookies notice for people. I think Cookie Yes is an example of that. And then obviously, as you scale, they've got requirements that you hit a certain level when you've got to pay a fee. Say if you're getting like 10,000 views a month. Um, the templates for I guess the more complex areas of data compliance, things like um, data security policies, internal policies and procedures, and data sharing agreements do at that point become a bit more bespoke. And I am not aware of any kind of specific templates for them. There may be some out there, but in any event, I would want a template to be used very much as a starting point and not just sign this, because it won't cover what you're doing, basically.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions, or maybe over to you again, Jamie, just to finish up?
I don't. If no one's got any further questions, then yeah, just thank you everyone for joining. As I say, um we're more than happy to James and I to answer any questions you have from this session today. And to the extent you have any, do get in touch with us after the session. But thank you very much for joining on a Tuesday morning. We appreciate it's an early start, but hopefully we've given you some insights that are helpful.